In the first section of this chapter, we reviewed all of the eating and feeding disorders and gave you a reasonable description. In this section, we're going to be looking at the eating disorders that are most common: anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorders, and cover a little bit about the research and treatment for those disorders. Let's start with cross-cultural considerations. In general, we see eating disorders like anorexia and bulimia primarily in middle to upper middle class Caucasian women. Anorexia typically in the early to mid-teens in terms of their onset. Bulimia primarily in college-age women, and usually women who are actually in college. When people move to the United States from parts of the world where such eating disorders are almost unheard of, within a year or two, their rate of the eating disorders is comparable to what's going on in our culture, which suggests that the culture is having a big effect, and that it doesn't take long for someone from another culture to be influenced by whatever it is that is influencing people in our culture. Now, I also want to point out a couple of other things. First of all, subcultures such as African Americans or Latino women are much less likely to show either anorexia or bulimia. So it isn't just the United States and Western cultures in general, but it's subcultures within the United States that seem to be affected. And as you're going to see, a lot of it seems to be a function of the standards of beauty that are currently recognized or forced onto people as part of our culture. Standards that are much more strict among women than among men. This illustrates the subculture differences in the United States, looking just at Caucasian and African American women. Now, these are survival curves. So the more people in the subgroup develop the disorder, the lower they fall. So if we look at anorexia, anorexia is almost unheard of in the black population in the United States. It's found almost exclusively in Caucasian women. Bulimia is much, much more common among Caucasian than African American women. Binge eating disorder is still more common in Caucasian women, but it's, definitely represented in the African American culture. So what's going on? We believe, and there's some evidence to support this, that the current cultural imperative for women, especially Caucasian women, especially high-achieving Caucasian women, is that somehow thinness has become associated with being beautiful, happy, successful. And not only that, the thinness is unreasonably thin. It's not natural. It's way below what would be the normal weight for women. And this is reinforced because, well, frankly, in glamour magazines, you don't see on the covers normal weight women. You tend to see women who, at the very least, are thin, and sometimes almost emaciated thin. Now, that's a very new concept. In the 1950s, for example, Playboy magazine was introduced, I believe in 54 or 55. And the first centerfold for Playboy was Marilyn Monroe, who at the time was considered one of the most beautiful women in the world. But by today's standards, she probably would be described as overweight, and some people might even describe her worse than that. But she wasn't overweight. She was certainly a normal weight for the time. It's really been just the last 50 years or so when our culture has glorified this thinness, and not for men, almost exclusively for women. And again, if you look in African American, Latino cultures, they don't glorify that thinness nearly as much, was probably one of the reasons why there's such a low rate of these disorders. So what happens? Well, you diet if the only way to be happy is to be thin, and you view any kind of, normal weight as being fat. And of course, your peers are subject to the same thing, so they put pressure on you. And so that dieting becomes a habit. Now, what is dieting? You are restraining your eating. You are restraining your eating enough that you lose weight, which means you are not eating enough to meet your body needs. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this particular graph. It's pretty much self-explanatory. This is looking at the perceptions of men and women in terms of their own body size and how it compares to what they think is an ideal body size, and a body size that a member of the opposite sex would find pleasing. Look at it closely and you'll see that women experience their own body size typically as being a long ways from their ideal and from what they think men are looking for. And men are just simply not subjected to that kind of pressure. So let's look at this pressure, starting with anorexia and starting with the typical family that you find in anorexia. Now, this is typical. Not every family with anorexia is like this. But in general, the girls who develop anorexia, and I say girls because usually this starts in very early teenage years, are like the perfect daughter. They're good in school. They're compliant. They do what they're supposed to do. They're well liked. They may be a little overweight, and they want to lose that weight, and so they start a diet. And it goes well, and they get reinforced. But they don't stop the diet. They don't feel thin enough, so they just keep dieting until they get from their family concern that their health is being affected. Now they're not being reinforced for dieting. They're being punished. At least they're getting all this concern, you got to eat, and yet they continue to diet. Now, typically in the family, the whole family is successful generally and driven to be successful. And typically, often, dieting on a chronic basis. Now, there's a strong genetic component in that the heritability index for anorexia is actually quite high. But we don't know what it is that's inherited. Maybe it's the perfectionism to be this perfect little girl. And perfect isn't just being thinner, it's being the thinnest, thinner than anyone else. Or maybe it's a difference in the way they respond emotionally to stress. I mean, there's 100 different things that could be inherited, and there are probably several of them. One issue that I want to point out when we talk about biological issues, the hypothalamus regulates hunger, absolutely critical to our survival. We know from studies with rats that if you damage a portion of the hypothalamus, the rat will starve to death because even though food is there, the rat has no hunger and therefore no desire to consume the food. And they never get a desire even as they are starving to death. If instead you damage a different portion of the hypothalamus. The rat won't stop eating. It will eat and eat and eat. Occasionally you'll see in textbook pictures of such rats who have eaten so much that they can't put all 4 of their legs down on the ground at the same time because their stomach is so large from the excess weight that they put on. So you would think that the hypothalamus could easily play a role in a disorder such as anorexia. The evidence is very clear. The hypothalamus doesn't seem to have any impact at all. This is a psychological disorder in the sense that the normal eating elements of the brain are not what is driving it. Serotonin is also dysregulated in anorexia. It's also dysregulated in bulimia as well. And that may be one of the reasons why depression is common in bulimia. And it may also account for occasional impulsivity. At this point, all we know, however, is that there's an association. We don't know if that association has any causal link at all. What about psychological factors? The drawing here illustrates the body image disturbance often found in eating disorders. You see a young woman, thin, I mean really, really thin, excessively thin, but she doesn't see herself the same way. She sees herself as overweight and is still needing to lose more weight. So that disturbance drives them to diet excessively, both in anorexia and in bulimia as well. Often they have a limited sense of control. And in anorexia, their eating or lack thereof may in fact represent a way of feeling in control. They're often successful. The majority of women with anorexia or bulimia are talented, successful people, but they don't feel successful. They don't have a lot of confidence. They have such perfectionistic standards that they could probably never live up to them, and that may be why they have so low sense of self-confidence. Often mood fluctuates in these women. Mood fluctuates, of course, in everyone. But for women with eating disorders, the mood fluctuations tend to be more traumatic. And they try to maintain their mood in a stable way, just like they're trying to maintain their weight. Now, I apologize for this picture, but unfortunately, this is a all too common picture. There is starvation in the world all the time. And the sad thing is there's more than enough food being produced in the world to feed every man, woman, and child. So when such starvation occurs, it's not because there's a drought in the area. It's because war and other political upheavals are preventing the food to get to the people who need it the most. These children obviously are extremely emaciated. They are starving. The child in the middle, if you look at his stomach, it's starting to distend. If he doesn't get food, he probably is going to die within a couple of weeks. That's how bad the starvation is. Now, what does that have to do with eating disorders? When you diet excessively, your body doesn't know whether you're starving or not, and your body evolved to have periods when starvation occurred. Because until transportation systems were available so that we could move food to wherever it was needed, if you happen to live in a part of the world where there was a severe drought, there might be no crops. And there might be very limited food. And for months, there would be people on the edge of starvation, just barely alive, because they had so little food available. So our body evolved to respond to that. We slow our metabolism during such periods. Now, that's not good for diets, because if you diet heavily, one of the things that happens is you have to diet even more to lose weight, because your body's metabolism slows, so the same number of calories lasts a longer period of time. So you got to diet more intensely to lose more weight. But it prevents people from starving in the evolutionary history that we've lived through. Now, how powerful are our responses to starvation? And again, severe dieting is starvation. Okay, as long as you're losing weight, it means you're not getting enough food to meet your daily needs. That's the only way you lose weight. During World War II, there were a number of people, we call them conscientious objectors, and there still are conscientious objectors. It's just that with the draft gone, they usually are not a part of the process. But with World War II, there were people who simply could not bring themselves to kill even the enemy. And our country recognized that and allowed them to contribute to the war efforts in other ways. And one of the ways that many people volunteered to do was to experience periods of starvation. Very low calorie intake. Traditionally, in these studies, it was 500 calories a day. At 500 calories a day, you lose weight. You lose a lot of weight, and you keep losing weight, although the rate slows down as your metabolism slows down. Why did they run such studies? Well, it was very common in war for their food to not make it to the front lines. So there would be soldiers that sometimes would be fighting for 2 or 3 days in a row with almost no food. And the question is, how much does that affect their ability to fight? How important is it to get the food there? How important is it to bring people out of the front lines if they, for example, have not been able to eat much during a long period of time? What we found is very interesting. One, when you are starving, all you think about is food. You think about it day and night, which has probably great evolutionary significance, because animals during a period of starvation who are thinking about food all the time are likely to be looking for food all the time. And they are more likely to find food than animals that aren't looking quite as often. And so they're more likely to survive. The other thing is that if food is available and you've been starving, what you do is you gulp down as much food as you possibly can whenever it's available. We have a name for that. We call it binging. Binging is a normal response to severe dieting, i.e., starvation. It's very hard not to binge when your body desperately is screaming out, I need more food. If the food's available, you will want to consume it. That leads to our model of why there is so much bulimia in our culture now, and why that rate has increased so dramatically over the past 50 years.